It is May 10th, 2024, and the UN General Assembly just passed a resolution recommending that the Security Council admit Palestine as a full member state. Now, Israel's ambassador to the UN is already throwing a temper tantrum about this, even though it's not an official member status for the state of Palestine. But it serves as a reminder that we are seeing a continued push in the world for full representation for the Palestinian people. It is a long process getting there, but it also goes against everything that the US is currently supporting right now when it comes to their ongoing support for Israel committing genocide in Gaza, when it comes to what the US is continuing to enable. And yes, that's even with President Biden making it sound like he is finally drawing red lines for Israel, although we know that that comes with a bit of a catch at the end of the day, given that he seems to think that Israel hasn't even touched the city of Rafah, while they have been bombing it and killing civilians there for weeks now. We discussed all that and more earlier with a special guest, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Patrick Henningsen, a geopolitical analyst, journalist, and host of both the 21st Century Wire and the Patrick Henningsen Show on TNT Radio. Patrick, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
My pleasure, Rachel.
Now, I wanted to get into the latest with you because I know we have some breaking news this just in that you had the United Nations General Assembly pass a resolution on the possibility of Palestine becoming a full-fledged member. Now, from what I'm seeing, this looks like it is just a recommendation for the Security Council to reconsider what they were previously looking at, which was the possibility of Palestine under the Palestinian Authority becoming a full UN member. What do you make of the fact that we are now even having a conversation about recognizing Palestine as a state in this way?
Yeah, this is a kind of complicated one, but let's just start with the fact that who supports this and who opposes it. So clearly, the United States does not support it. It's my understanding that they're voting against it, along with Israel and a few other states. So there's schizophrenia in terms of U.S. policy. You hear them talk about a two-state solution. You hear it a lot, but yet they don't want to give Palestine a platform at the UN. So at the Security Council level, it's almost certain that this is always going to be vetoed by the United States, of course. But at the General Assembly level, there's only a few mechanisms available to make something like this happen. So this is interesting. This is coming through a general vote at the General Assembly. The other option is through the United for Peace resolution. And I thought that would have been invoked, a lot earlier. They can also recommend to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that investigation be mounted against Israeli officials. They can also recommend sanctions against Israel at the UN level. And if that's voted for unanimously at the General Assembly level, it's as good as a binding mandate, but then it's up to individual countries to enforce it. So as we can see, not all UN Security Council resolutions are, especially with regards to Israel, are ever abided by. So this is a UN move here. I think this is good. It's more symbolic, though. You have the U.S. knows that a Palestinian two-state solution is not viable, and more. I think my personal opinion is, and more people on the kind of that support the Palestinian liberation cause, longtime activists that used to be two-state solution people are now moving into the one-state solution camp. In other words, one state, one viable state for everybody, equal rights under the law, no discrimination, no segregation, no apartheid. Whoever wants to stay stays. Whoever wants to leave can leave. So there's a lot more people supporting this because they realize there's not much of a Palestinian state left, and Israel will never allow them to have a standing army, an airport, a working maritime port. They'll still want to control almost everything that goes in and out of these territories, and they'll want to maintain all their security roads and all the way it's carved up like Bantustans in the West Bank, for instance. So, I mean, but it's still a lot. The other argument is, Rachel, that this is a positive step forward to recognize a Palestinian state, and through that first step through the door, they'll be able to pursue a more, hopefully, a just solution. So the idea that Israel will retreat to 1967 borders, and that's what most people would accept as a two-state solution, I don't think it will happen. Israel will never do that voluntarily. They will only do that after a military defeat. And how many lives is that going to cost? So that's the big question.
Yeah, and I know it's interesting too because I will say it's only in the last few months that I've even heard talk of a one democratic state, right? And I feel like that's becoming more popular because for so many years now we've been hit with this two-state solution. That is the way to go. But you're right. If even if there is a Palestinian state, you still run the risk that Israel is going to try to control everything, that they're going to try to whittle down any sort of power, any sort of land that they may have. And Israel is going to claim, oh, well, it's for national security purposes, right? We're concerned about the Palestinians as they have for years now. And now we continue to see the way that they actually treat the Palestinian people when they have the power to go into the Gaza Strip as they are now. I know that there have been a lot of concerns surrounding Rafah. And we even had President Biden come out this week and say in an interview that the US will not provide Israel with offensive weapons for a ground invasion of Rafah. But then the Israeli military comes out and confirms that they have more than enough weapons and supplies for this invasion. What do you make of this latest back and forth? I mean, are there really tensions between Biden and Netanyahu? Or is this just about Biden trying to score some political points when he knows that Israel is fine and it doesn't need that specific support from the US right now?
I would say both of those things, and I'll add in a third factor as well, is that I personally think all those things that you said are absolutely in play. It's an election year, so this has become a real noose around the neck of the Biden administration. I think the student protests, how they proliferated around the country, have made a massive impact. Just look at how much effort the establishment, the media, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, everybody, the Jewish and the Israeli lobbies, they're piling in on these students. So they must be effective. There must be something going on these campuses that are changing the narrative. So I think this is a real crisis moment for the Biden administration and for the Democratic Party, because normally Joe Biden's pitch in 2020 was courting the youth, that he's this grandfather figure, and that he'll help this young Gen Zers transition into the modern age with his wisdom and experience and all this other stuff. And so he's lost Gen Z with this issue. I mean, it's pretty clear. These are the influencers in America of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old. The vanguard, political vanguards on campuses, intense, supporting Palestine. That's the reality. So there's that, plus with regards to U.S. and Israel, they have to show maybe at least publicly a little bit of restraint, because otherwise no one's going to trust the United States because of previous statements they've made saying Rafah was a red line. Well, it's clearly not a red line. It's a pink line. And he says an invasion. Well, not an invasion, but a major invasion. Then it becomes a semantic argument. Have they invaded? Is it a major invasion? If it's a major invasion, we'll withhold weapons. If it's just a minor invasion and some bombing, it's okay. We'll still supply weapons. But there's the third factor. The third factor is the United States may not have ammunition and artillery to give Israel because they're spread thin through all of their commitments globally, plus Ukraine, plus what they've given to Israel in the last 7 months. Okay, so what's more embarrassing? This is the important political question. Is it more embarrassing for the global hegemon to run out of ammunition and shells, or is it worse for them politically to not show total solidarity and support for the state of Israel? So if that could be a genuine conundrum, to avoid the embarrassment of the former, one would have to sort of adopt or feign the latter. And I think there's an element of this, and that was suggested to me by Larry Johnson, former CIA operative and military analyst, in a recent conversation we had, and he thinks this is the case. But it's all of the above, Rachel. It's everything that you mentioned, plus I think the logistical problems the U.S. is running into.
That's an interesting point, and I hadn't thought of that aspect of it. But, that is a really important point, I think, especially when it comes to what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. And you've got Russia's industrial capacity just exploding. And then you've got NATO over here. And yet they keep adding more and more on. They can't even keep up with Ukraine. And they're like, oh, we've got to help Israel, as Israel is trying to start World War III with Iran. And then, oh, we need to help Taiwan. And it's like, is no one kind of reining them in and making them realize, hey, if we're going into a World War III situation, you're picking fights with all of these different countries that are going to be working together against you. It doesn't seem like there's much logic there, but I guess that's not really the point. But one thing you pointed out there was the fact that, the Biden administration, they're almost kind of acting as if Israel hasn't even touched Rafah yet, right? They're acting like, oh, it's some city off in the distance. They're just planning a ground invasion, when the reality is that we've seen Israel bombing Rafah for weeks now, killing civilians there. And then they also went in this week. Again, that goes back to the, well, not a major invasion, but they took over the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, and they're cutting off the humanitarian aid that would have been going into there. So Biden acts like he cares about the civilians while at the same time being fine with cutting off more of their aid. What does this tell us about what the Biden administration is actually willing to accept here?
Well, what does it tell us about what the Biden administration and the government, the Netanyahu regime, I'll use the pejorative because everybody does anyway, the regime in Tel Aviv, what are they planning? So the day the U.S. announced they finished this military-built floating pier or port in central Gaza, right at the line that splits the north and the south, is the same day Israel takes over the Rafah border crossing. Exact same time. So what does that tell us? That tells us that what is the plan? You drive hundreds of thousands of people into refugee camps in Rafah and say it's a safe zone. Do that for 6 months, and you start bombing that safe zone. Where are the people expecting to go? They can't go back to northern Gaza. It's unlivable. There's some people that are living there and have stayed there and endured all of this, but all the utilities, basically civic life, infrastructure, it's all destroyed. So what are your options? Be pushed into Egypt. So it's going to apply pressure on Egypt. If Egypt is not going to allow those refugees in, that's what the U.S. and Israel want. That's their get out. That's their ace card, is Egypt allowing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and that fulfills a very explicit goal by the Licudists of depopulating the Palestinian areas. Okay, that is the end game. Let's not kid ourselves. This is what they're engineering from the onset till now. Then the other option is the safety valve is the U.S. military evacuating Palestinians at this new sort of seaport is supposed to bring in aid. I think the aid it brings in, like with the World Food Kitchen, this is a public relations stunt to change the optics of how people are viewing the U.S. military as a co-belligerent and enabler of a genocide to some kind of humanitarian force for good. I mean, this is just a perfect narrative flip. And this is what they tried to do with the World Food Kitchen, with the State Department and USAID, and to change the narrative. And then it didn't succeed after, because these aid workers were killed and they pulled out. I don't know what the full story behind that was. Nonetheless, the ultimate optics would be U.S. troops evacuating the poor and beleaguered Palestinian people, taking them to safety. The ultimate selfless humanitarian operation by the United States government. I mean, it would be great television. And to flip this narrative, you need some big, big spectacle. And it has to go on CNN. It's got to be absolutely stage managed. And I think that's the plan. Because if it was about humanitarian aid, they could just open the Rafah border crossing and tell the Israelis to let the trucks through. Because all those trucks that go through, it's not necessarily Egypt that's blocking them. It's that all of those are going to be searched and held up by Israel at checkpoints within, once they do pass the Egyptian border and the Gaza border. So it's this idea that Israel doesn't have control of the aid coming in and out of Rafah is ridiculous. They absolutely do. And they only allowed for intermittent airdrops because the Jordanians started doing a little bit of airdrops to Jordanian hospitals there. They had clearance from Tel Aviv, and a few other countries got involved, and it helped as a pressure release valve, I think, at the end of the day for everybody. So temporarily, it was good optics, but it's not. The airdrops is not a long-term solution in such a tiny area. It's like
Yeah.
it's a postage stamp, geographically. So why not just allow 400 trucks a day in? There's plenty of supplies. I mean, it's just unbelievable that it's been allowed. The siege has been allowed to maintain for 7 months. If
Yeah.
everything that we're seeing, campuses around the world, the protests, all because nothing has really been done to stop it. So it's like, so then there's Machiavellian forces in the U.S. and Israel are going to use the situation they created to create the solution that they want, and that's my biggest fear.
Mhm. Yeah, and I could see that happening, right? I see the fact that they have put this intentional blockade on the Gaza Strip. And you're right, it would be almost too easy to just allow enough aid in to allow for the women and the children. I mean, in Rafah, we're talking about around 600,000 children packed into that city to allow them the aid that they desperately need. And yet, Israel will claim, oh, well, we're concerned about Hamas getting access to it. And it's like, well, clearly you're not defeating Hamas. And that's without the aid, that's without whatever the claims that they may make as they continue to target the Palestinian civilian population. And I know that there's been a lot of concerns when it comes to those plans for Rafah, as you've had reports of Israel setting up checkpoints to allow some women and children out, but then to keep any sort of the men, even boys there, right? Because they are claiming, oh, well, those are Hamas fighters. Automatically, a Palestinian man, a Palestinian teenage boy is a Hamas fighter in their eyes. That plays into their numbers at the end of the day. And you had Biden this week admit that US made weapons are being used to kill civilians in Gaza. Now, he's trying to kind of keep that space there, right? As if, you're like, oh, well, I just gave an AK-47 to someone who was a mass shooter before, and then they carried out another mass shooting. I don't know how that happened, right? He almost tries to claim this plausible deniability. But when do we get to the point of the US realizing, hey, these weapons that are being sent to Israel, they are using them in this genocidal war against the Palestinian people, and there needs to be some responsibility here? Or is that something that no matter how many protests we see, the US government is still going to act as if it just can't understand how these massacres keep happening?
They've lured us into a long tail story here, and that's the irony of it. The fact that the brakes weren't applied back in November and December, and it's been allowed to get to this point. The numbers, by the way, in terms of victims and people who've died, women and children, people stuck under the rubble, are hugely underestimated. They haven't recovered. There could be 10,000 plus potentially people still missing that haven't been accounted for. So, I mean, then you're into the 50,000 mark in terms of people who died, many over 100,000 injured probably. So it's been allowed to go this long. So they've dragged the narrative this long. And I think now people have issue fatigue. And this is the problem. So they'll accept pretty much anything, any temporary ceasefire as a gimmick, or any sort of announcement of a ceasefire. And you know how it goes. They'll say, "Oh, they've agreed to a ceasefire." Everybody was celebrating, and then Israel will say Hamas violated the ceasefire the following week, and then we're back into another cycle again. So I think this is the problem with this issue. That's the irony of this issue. The U.S. has dropped the equivalent of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on Gaza using Israeli planes, actually American planes, just piloted by Israelis. They've already done that, and now they're saying. So imagine your analogy, Rachel. Instead, we could say they've dropped the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, And then after that, they're saying, but you can't have the AK-47 now. Aren't we great, de-escalation partners here? You can't have the bullets for your AK-47. We've just leveled the whole city. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is. And I think another aspect to this too, of course, we are in an election year. You have Joe Biden struggling to try to make it look like he cares about the Palestinians because he knows that a significant portion of his base, they care and they may not be voting for him in November because of that one issue. But then on the other hand, because of course we live in this country of freedom and democracy where we have two main choices, and that's about it. And well, in many cases, when it comes to this main election, I should say, the other person, of course, is Donald Trump, a very big supporter of Israel who is now doubling down, criticizing Biden for threatening to cut off just some weapon supplies. Where does that leave the Americans who genuinely care about Gaza? They care about the long term consequences of US support for Israel. Yet they look at these top two contenders and they realize, well, wait a second, neither one of these people are going to do anything to stop this.
Well, they could always go to a viable third party option. Who do we got? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. How about him? Well, he's just as hawkish as Trump and Biden on Israel, even more so. He's the most hawkish pro-Israeli president. So there's no options for the American people. I mean, you can cast a protest vote with Jill Stein and the Green Party, and that's a perfectly acceptable option, I think, for anybody, because they'd be really upset about what they've seen done in their name with public money and with the full-throated support of U.S. Congress and the entire government. I mean, and our military and everything, and all our NATO partners are on board. I mean, this is a real low point, I think, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, in terms of the morality threshold that you'd expect. The bare minimum is that you'd intervene after a couple of weeks. When the death toll hit 1,000 or something, because in the past that's what happened with Operation Protective Edge, Operation Cast Lead, previous major military campaigns against the people in Gaza by the IDF. There was international pressure. You guys, you've done enough. Now let's just slow it down. That didn't happen this time. Why? Why didn't that happen this time? That's the big question. Is it because Israel believed that they finally had that mandate through the through the contortion of the October 7th narrative, and the propaganda that was generated, and the stories about beheaded babies and mass rape and all of these things that they attributed to Hamas were the rally cry. They were the battle cry to mobilize Israeli society, their support globally, and the military themselves to pound Gaza and take no prisoners and invoke the Hannibal Directive. And that's it. Scorched earth policy. Do we have a better example in the modern era of scorched earth than this?
Yeah.
It's better than Raqqa. It's more than Raqqa or Mosul. I mean, that was bad, but you didn't have in the space of time, and the fact that this is such a densely populated area, you still didn't have these numbers, these official numbers there. They're probably underestimated with Raqqa and Mosul, and there's studies that allude to that, but they were allowed to evacuate. At least where do the Palestinians evacuate to in Gaza? There's not much to Rafah or Khan Yunis or whatever. There's not much options, and they've chased them and killed them as they fled. So so for America, this is a major crisis, I think, that hasn't hit home yet. I think it will hit home in the coming years even more, because all of these student protesters who don't watch CNN and Fox, who don't get their news from cable, they have a very different worldview and interpretation of this special relationship with Israel that the U.S. claims it has. They have a very different view of this than than the boomer and the millennials even generation. So that means that the policy will eventually change, but maybe not immediately. But it might end up, I think there could be a force majeure for Israel, because they're stuck in a death spiral. And Netanyahu needs to keep the war going, the ethnic cleansing going, the genocide, you could say, going, in order to keep his government in power and keep the Likud coalition, this far right coalition, viable. If he stops, then he's out of power, and the Israeli society will have to have a reckoning, both domestically and internationally, as to what just happened this last 7 months. So they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. So they're just going to keep on the course. But the more they stay on the course of this war, the more international condemnation is going to be heaped on Israel. So they're going to lose. This is just one of those biblical tragedies. This is a Faustian like fable of an epic that they're locked in. They're locked into certain demise. And the Americans are, our senators and the hawkish wing of the Republican Democratic Party, they're doing victory laps. They think that Israel is just doing so great. They're defeating Hamas and we're stamping those student protests out. We're really showing them who's in charge. But they have no idea what global public opinion how is reading this. The U.S. cannot afford to lose allies when the empire is in decline. And this is exactly what they're doing. They're losing potential allies going forward. And they're going to regret this. I think, Washington will regret this in coming years. And then what we'll do is what we always do is when things aren't going well for us, because as a result of all the bad decisions our government and military have taken, we'll blame other countries on the blowback, basically. That's basically the pattern. It's just like a national narcissism, you could say. That's that's where it is. So, I mean, we've seen the pattern over and over again. If you look at U.S. broad foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, every move for the last 60 years has been to patch up the previous move. It's just one after the other, and it keeps rolling over. And that's how we justify most of our policies, is that we need to mitigate this problem or this instability. But of course, this is instability the United States itself has caused. And you can show this very clear, this pattern going from 1960 all the way to the present, from the Suez crisis all the way to the present. So this is just going to end up being another sordid episode in that pattern. Question is, will it escalate into a wider conflict? That's the other big question mark.
Yeah, and I know that especially in this, growing multipolar world that we're in, you're seeing other countries, other major world powers in a position where they're looking at the US and they're going, "We've seen what you've done when you were, the unipolar world power, and we don't want that to continue." And I know it is, as you're pointing it out there, it is a long process, but it is a process that, I think in some cases needs to happen because of all of the US corruption that we've seen spread around the world. And because you have those hawks in Washington that still will not learn, and they allow for tragedies like what we're seeing right now in Gaza, and they enable it to continue to happen. I know that there's certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down the latest here. Patrick Henningsen, a geopolitical analyst, journalist, and host of both the 21st Century Wire and the Patrick Henningsen Show on TNT Radio. Thank you so much for your time and insight today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.